So welcome to part 10 of my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue of the Sophist. So up until this point, we have done 19 hours in this dialogue. And so there's a lot of material there. There's a lot of different thought experiments that we've gone down. A lot of different mental exercises. And there have been many things learned. In light of giving a summary of where we have been, I've increasingly found it difficult the farther we go into this dialogue. But some of the key points, it's worth mentioning that we are on a hunt for this person that we call the Sophist. He is an expert in selling knowledge about virtue. He has expertise in pleasing people. He's an expert debater. He debates for money. It can be said that he participates with the youthful mind. He is somebody that has been found hiding in a particular domain, a domain of that which is not. Sometimes a domain of that which is, and this is where it gets difficult. Our conversation has been brought to a point where we are discussing being and non-being. And we've come to a conclusion, or maybe at least a comfortable situation, in which we are reflecting on the relationship of being and non-being. We've established that neither that which is nor that which is not is something that may exist in and of itself, independently, let's say. Each of them have independent identities, surely. But the power or the influence of difference and the influence of that which is constantly intermixed. It's like this interwoven network. Sometimes, for whatever reason, I think about a sock. When you look at it closely, all of these interwoven fibers. And I say that to say that that which is not, difference, otherness, is necessary to identify one thing apart from another. It's relational, in other words. The substrate, of course, that it operates in is the substrate of that which is. And I think what it affords us is this dynamic, unfolding experience of reality. So I'll read an important paragraph on the part of one of our interlocutors. I should mention that the dialogue is between two people, the visitor and Theaetetus. The visitor is from Elea, a Greek colony in Italy, and Theaetetus is an Athenian youth. And they are discussing this together. And before I read this section, I'll also mention that our flow is going to be a reading of 2 pages and then a reflection on those 2 pages. The reflection, of course, takes the longest. It takes me a few reads to really solidify and to come up with different exercises that helps me remember the material that I'm going through and make sense of it, of course. So, just as some background information to bring us up to speed of where we are, about a page ago from where we are now, the visitor says, "But now it apparently does share in that which is. So he probably wouldn't still put up a fight about that. Perhaps, though, he might say that some forms share in that which is not, and some don't, and that speech and belief are ones that don't. So he might contend again that copy-making and appearance-making, in which we said he was contained, totally are not. His ground would be that belief and speech don't associate with that which is not, and that without this association, falsity totally is not. That's why we have to search around for speech, belief, and appearance, and first discover what they are, and so that when they appear, we see their association with that which is not clearly. Then when we've seen that clearly, we can show that falsity is, and when we've shown that we can tie the sophist up in it, if we can keep hold of him, or else we'll let him go and look for him in another kind. So, that brings us to the present moment. We are on the first of these three things that we are exploring now. Speech. And just to read a little bit from the previous page as well. There are two ways to use your voice to indicate something about being. One kind is called names, and the other kind is called verbs. A verb is the sort of indication that's applied to an action, and a name is the kind of spoken sign that applies to things that perform the actions. So no speech is formed just from names spoken in a row, and also not from verbs that are spoken without names. Things don't form speech if they're said in a row, like this: walks, runs, sleeps, and other verbs that signify actions. Even if somebody said all of them, one after another, that wouldn't be speech. Now Theaetetus responds, of course not. Now here we are up to our present moment. The visitor, again, if somebody said lion, stag, horse, and whatever names there are of things that perform actions, the series wouldn't make up speech. The sounds he uttered in the first or second way wouldn't indicate either an action or an inaction, or the being of something that is or of something that is not until he mixed verbs with nouns. But when he did that, they'd fit together, and speech, the simplest and smallest kind of speech, I suppose, would arise from that first weaving of name and verb together. Theaetetus says, what do you mean? When someone says man learns, would you say that's the shortest and simplest kind of speech? Yes. Since it gives an indication about what is, or comes to be, or has come to be, or is going to be. And he doesn't just name, but accomplishes something by weaving verbs with names. That's why we said he speaks and doesn't just name. In fact, this weaving is what we use the word speech for. Theaetetus is right. So some things fit together and some don't. Likewise, some focal signs don't fit together, but the ones that do produce speech. Absolutely. But there's still this small point. What? Whenever there's speech, it has to be about something. It's impossible for it not to be about something. Yes. And speech also has to have some particular quality. Of course. Now let's turn our attention to ourselves. All right. The visitor says, I'll produce some speech by putting a thing together with an action by means of a name and a verb. You have to tell me what it's about. I'll do it as well as I can. The visitor says, Theaetetus sits. That's not a long piece of speech, is it? No, not too long. Your job is to tell what it's about, what it's of. Clearly it's about me, of me. Then what about this one? What one? Theaetetus, to whom I'm now talking, flies. No one would ever deny that it's of me and about me. We also say that each piece of speech has to have some particular quality. Yes. What quality should we say each of these has? Theaetetus says, the second one is false, I suppose, and the other one is true. And the true one says, those that are, as they are, about you. Of course. And the false one says things different from those that are. Yes. So it says those that are not, but that they are. I suppose so. But there are different things that are from the things that are about you, since we said that concerning each thing many beings are, and many are not. Absolutely. In the first place, the second piece of speech I said about you must be one of the shortest there is, according to our definition of speech. We agreed to that just now, anyway. And we agreed that it's of something. Yes. And if it is not of you, it isn't of anything else. Of course not. And if it were not of anything, it would not be speech at all, since we showed that it was impossible for speech, that is, to be speech that is of nothing. Absolutely right. But if someone says things about you, but says different things as the same, or not beings as beings, then it definitely seems that false speech really and truly arises from that kind of putting together of verbs and names. Yes, very true. Well then, isn't it clear by now that both true and false thought and belief and appearance can occur in our souls? How? The best way for you to know how is for you to first grasp what they are and how they're different from each other. Then just tell me. Aren't thought and speech the same, except that what we call thought is speech that occurs without the voice, inside the soul, in conversation with itself? So this is the end of those 2 pages. So let's do some thinking about what is being said here. This may not be the most philosophically rich 2 pages that we've experienced, but I think there's definitely some things for us to chew on here. So let's spend some time and be productive. So I want to begin with the first statement by the visitor. He says, if somebody said lion, stag, horse, and whatever names there are of things that perform actions, the series wouldn't make up speech. Okay, so I think the first thing that we have to do is really pay attention to what he means by speech. I think it can be said, it can be interpreted, it can be seen, that what speech is an attempt to communicate that may involve verbalization. Well, maybe that must necessarily involve verbalization and the formulation of words. Now, from the visitor's perspective, surely speech involves vocalization, it involves words, but this is not sufficient to describe speech. There's additional qualities to it. There must be a noun and there must be an action. Lion, stag, horse. It's interesting. I think in certain respects one can call this speech. But there's an important component of this when the visitor recognizes that words without strong association with others, without an implication, without a context, really leave us lacking. And that although there's this verbalization and there is an accurate articulation of a word, even this doesn't account for speech. That there must be a connecting or a contextual or a relevant addition to this that causes us to recognize it as speech. The sounds he uttered in the first or second way wouldn't indicate either an action or an inaction, or the being of something that is or of something that is not. Now, this part I had difficulty understanding, because surely I could say one word. I could just take one out of the three that he mentioned. I could take stag. And from my perspective, it would seem that I have identified something that is. I have identified a being. Now, certainly it's understandable that the sounds that were uttered in the second instance here, again, the lion, stag, horse, that they don't indicate an action or an inaction. These are names to describe animals. But then he says, or the being of something that is, or of something that is not. Now, I suppose this is a good opportunity to think about this term indication and think about names of themselves. Now, as described in the earlier episode, speaking of the word indicate, from our old rooted sense, it's composed of in, towards, or upon, dicare, or D-I-C-A-R-E, to proclaim, to declare, to dedicate. And so there's this sort of verbal, linguistic placeholder composed of various letters, composed of various elements. The elements by themselves don't mean much until they're put together. When they are put together, even the word itself doesn't mean anything until it's associated with a being. And so we understand lion, stag, and horse to be something because of its association. And the very thing that I think the visitor is trying to do is give us the importance of relation and of association between a name and a verb. Now, if it is to be the case that there is something about an action that causes a name, even by its association to something that is, to actually be something that is, then we have to think about what it is about the action that causes the thing to be. Now, I can say that the knight rides the horse. So we have an action, and we have two beings in here. Not like the number of beings really matters. But I struggle to see how the knight's riding has anything to do with the increase in his being or non-being. But perhaps this is not the way to conceptualize what is being said here. Now earlier, I had taken, and I have taken currently, chess pieces to represent various identities or concepts that I might be trying to understand. One of them, one of the most important ones, is the idea of that which is. We could say being, and that is represented as the king. And so I look at him when I think about this this part of the dialogue. What comes to mind is the initial materialization, let's say, of this concept. So now that every time I look at the king, I feel as though that I am looking at a part of that which is. It's not a complete being. His static existence is not something that encapsulates his true identity, his true being. He is encapsulated in this form as is necessary to give light to the concept of what he is, let's say. It doesn't say what he is for or what he can be. It just says that this is. It's not until the bishop comes along with his pawns. He has 4 pawns in this scenario. The bishop is a representative of that which is not, or difference, or otherness. And it separates things. They view upon the king that which is, and they don't diminish him, but they assist in the experience of identification and of expanding relations. And so we have all of these other cast of characters. We have the knight, we have the rook, we have the queen. And actually, now that I think about it, I'm wondering if we should change the bishop's role to something different, and the queen should occupy that which is not. I think that makes most sense. So from here on out, I will be referring to the queen and her pawns as that which is not, or non-being. And so I wonder about how this is phrased, and if it maybe could be phrased a little bit better. The sounds he uttered in the first or second way wouldn't indicate either an action or an inaction, or the being of something that is, or of something that is not. It would be something that is, insofar as we have that representation like we do of the king. But surely, as we understand at this point, we cannot reduce everything to the king. Otherwise, difference, identity, falsity, everything would be incorrect. And in fact, change, growth, creation, all of this would be impossible because of the singular is so constrictive, does not allow any difference, any change. But when we add an action to a degree, we add difference, we add purpose behind his being, direction, motion to his being. So much like I can say that the knight rides the horse, we don't see the knight and the horse as the singular object. We see his motion. We see his participation. And it is by his associations that we are able to more fully see his being. He says, not until he mixes verbs with nouns. But when he did that, they'd fit together, and speech, the simplest and smallest kind of speech, would arise from that first weaving of name and verb together. So speech, then, must necessarily also presume that the object, the aim, the goal, is to establish, to move away from the conceptual identity that we might place just for a mental placeholder, again like the king being the physical manifestation of that which is, but of course he is not that which is, or rather the full participation of that which is. It is not until he is seen by the pawn of difference that we then are able to identify difference. And moreover, from just difference in identity, when our pawns look upon an identity in action, in motion, in relation to something, what expands is that being. So today happens to be a new day, new thoughts. So picking up where we left off, I want to read the last sentence of where we were. But when he did that, they fit together, and speech, the simplest and smallest kind of speech, I suppose, would arise from that first weaving of name and verb together. When someone says man learns, would you say that that's the shortest and simplest kind of speech? Theaetetus says yes. Since he gives an indication about what is, or comes to be, or has come to be, or is going to be, and he doesn't just name, but accomplishes something by weaving verbs with names. That's why we said he speaks and doesn't just name. In fact, this weaving is what we use the word speech for. Okay, let's think about this for a little bit. We're going to build on this idea of expanding the relationship of that which is not to that which is. But we're using a particular example. I think the broad context here matters. We've been looking for the Sophist quite steadily for a long time now. And this conversation about being and non-being, that which is not, is fundamental to that equation. It has to deal with truth and falsehood. The fundamental category of speech, although a complex one, participates in such a way that we understand inherently the experience of speech. But like many things that are quite simple, they go past our immediate rational reflections. Again, because they are so fundamental, ingrained. And so I think now about when the visitor said man learns as one of the most simple expressions of speech. For here we have the object and we have the verb. And a moment ago we were talking about the role of this verb. What exactly it adds to speech. If we think about speech as having two legs, let's say, one being our object, or the noun, and the other being the verb, we can easily understand how that which is wound up in something that is identifiable. And I want to be careful here not to go into this trap that I fell into earlier, where I was confused about why, if we just have a noun that is separate from the verb, that why we wouldn't have something that is. So I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say that our object is totally that which is. Since it is an identity, it has to participate also in that which is not. Which also means then that we're not just talking about a dichotomy between that which is and that which is not, that which is being the noun and that which is not being the verb. There's something more sophisticated than that. It's building on top of the concepts. Both of these things, the noun and the verb, have this interaction and interplay between that which is and that which is not. And the further reason that I come here, let's just take the object, for example, which I am defining as the bishop, the chess piece of the bishop, and then the rook being the verb. Their distinction with their particular character as the chess pieces doesn't really matter here. Just my holding cells, my representation. And if I ask myself, again, just to solve that pitfall from earlier, I ask myself of the bishop, or of the noun, certainly it is a thing that is. But since it is a thing that is, and it is not the king, it is not that which is, the concept, the symbolic embodiment of that concept. It is something that participates in that which is. Then I know that by its separate identity from the form of that which is, that it also has that which is not within it, influencing it, seeing it. But to get to the verb, this is something a little bit more foreign. Again, we have to maintain the assertion that the object and the verb come together to form speech, because by itself it is not sufficient. And although I had sort of described this earlier, in the process of understanding the verb, I wish to flesh this out in a little bit more detail. So when Different gazes upon the rook, again symbolized as the verb, it sees a specific identity. So we have this relationship, that which is not, that which is. A verb indicates an action. It points to something. Of an action, we could say that it is of doing. It points to how that which is interacts with other things. How it interacts with itself, maybe. So when we take the man in the form of the bishop, we see him as an agent with so much potential, identified through otherness from the form of that which is. And we have this capacity given by the rook, the indication for learning. And so he takes on this particular behavior. Maybe he does exactly what we do now. He reads something, he tries to digest it, he chews on it, he comes up with ideas, he stores memories, and perhaps he passes on the information, or he uses the information in some other relationship with some other identity. But the thing is, it's simple enough to give us an idea where being now I'm having some difficulty with language here, but where being must be, must go, must be realized as. Again, if we take the man as he is, we might fall into the trap, although he is a particular identity, of moving him so close to the form of that which is, that we are unable to see his purpose or his interaction among things. If we formalize him and take away the action or the participation in being, then we are left with a formal representation of him. Much like if we are left with a formal representation of that which is, and then try to drape it over all of everything, there would be no difference, there would be no identities, there would be no knowing, there would just be that which is. A sort of homogeneous experience of experience. So moving back into the visitor's explanation, his explanation for why man learns is the shortest and simplest kind of speech. He gives an indication about what is. So a difficult thing, I think, to comprehend. Since it gives an indication about what is. Keeping in mind that we can think about this in any number of ways. That doesn't have to necessarily be restricted to learning. But since we are talking about man learns, an indication about what is. So we have a cue for a participation in the form of that which is. The indication in this sense seems to be learning, or a type of learning. He continues, or comes to be. Now, learning is surely a process through which one can come to be something different than they were, come to be more informed or less informed, given what type of learning takes place, I suppose. But maybe there's a philosophical road there too. But putting that aside, he says, or has come to be. Perhaps a realization. In the process of learning, there are many things that have come to be as the result or things that are, for which I was entirely ignorant of how they have come to exist. And perhaps that there is, as he continues, or is going to be, there is also this way in which we can see a bit into the future by recognizing patterns among things and digesting the way in which it will unfold, how the interactions will continue or to change. He continues, and he doesn't just name, but accomplishes something by weaving verbs with names. So I want to start at the end of that sentence and work our way backwards. by weaving verbs with names. Now the interesting thing here, I think, is that we've already experienced a weaving, and that weaving has been in the form of the noun and also the verb. We have the weaving of that which is and that which is not. Now we are building on top of that and say we are weaving the noun and the verb together such that something happens, such that he accomplishes something. Now, in the original sense of the word, accomplish, it meant to complete fully, to fulfill a promise, duty, or task. Later, there was additional definitions meaning to achieve something notable or praiseworthy, to bring to successful execution. And he says that this has happened, this accomplishment, again, this filling up, the completion of something, has happened by the weaving. I think we can pause there and we can say, okay, there's probably plenty of these types of philosophical roads that we can go down and think about this weaving pattern. And we can continue and say, by weaving verbs with names, a particular type of weaving. Now, he doesn't say anything in particular about what is being accomplished, but he just says something. Now, what is something? Well, it is that which is, and it is also that which is not. So what we have produced is a relationship to something different, a new identity, this somethingness. Again, it is the structure that is produced by the relationship between the noun and the object, or the verb. So if we symbolize this as the knight, as being the offspring of this bishop and rook, the identity of this thing is the result, the consequence, the participation in being of the man learning. The visitor continues, he says, that's why we said he speaks and doesn't just name. For if he just named something, he would be identifying an identity, but he wouldn't be participating in this weaving pattern. He wouldn't be creating anything. He would just be observing it. He'd be exercising his faculty to see difference among things. In fact, this weaving is what we use the word speech for. So here we have a more solid definition of the word speech, that it is involved in a particular process, that now we've gone past the intellectual exercise, the philosophical exercise of combining the noun to the verb. And now we say that speech participates in the very process of weaving, just like the most fundamental aspects of our reality, between that which is and that which is not, between being and non-being. So he continues and he says, so some things fit together and some don't. Likewise, some vocal signs don't fit together, but the ones that do produce speech. Whenever there's speech, it has to be about something. It's impossible for it not to be about something. Let's pause here for a moment. There's a thought that flashed through my mind, that what if we changed the simple kind of speech that we saw above, as man learns, to man says nothing, man does nothing. It's still about something. It is still about doing. It's about doing nothing. And so there's an interesting reflection on nothingness there, what it means to do nothing. But even in the most simple of senses, the verb and the noun, even if they don't imply some sort of high magnitude of being or participation, they still have some contextual relevance. He continues, he says, speech also has to have some particular quality. And so now we enter into this mental exercise. The visitor says, I'll produce some speech by putting a thing together with an action by means of a name and a verb. You have to tell me what it's about. He says, Theaetetus sits. That's not a long piece of speech, is it? He says, your job is to tell what it's about, what it's of. Theaetetus responds to this and he says, it's about me. The visitor gives another type of speech. He says, Theaetetus flies. Again, he says, it's about me. It's of me. The visitor reiterates that each piece of speech has to have some particular quality. And so he asks, what quality does each one of these have? Theaetetus responds that the second one is false, and the other one is true. The visitor clarifies, and he says that the true one says those that are as they are about you. The false one says things different from those that are, saying those that are not, but that they actually are. The visitor makes the distinction that of the things that are about Theaetetus, the false ones are different from those, necessarily. But there's a large pool concerning each thing. Many beings are, and many are not. The visitor says, we agreed that it's of something, and that it is, if it is not of you, it isn't of anything else. If it were not of anything, it would not be speech at all, since we showed that it was possible for speech, that is, to be speech that is of nothing. But if someone says things about you, but says different things as the same or not beings as beings, then it definitely seems that false speech really and truly arises from the kind of putting together of verbs and names. So let's go back a moment, retrace some of our steps, and ask ourselves the question, if it was not anything, if it was not of anything, why would it not be speech? Remembering again that speech is composed of the noun and the verb, two strong identities that contain that which is and that which is not, but give direction, give participation to being. It gives a relationship to being. It defines being. by the relationship of noun and verb. Now, if noun and verb indicates that its being is nothing, it's effectively indicating that it's not related to anything. So we may have a statement like Theaetetus flies, but we know that he does not fly. So although we have the marriage between noun and verb, we have an incomplete union, because what is identified, the difference that there is, does not hold what we might say as to the reality of the situation. So what we are exposed to is a particular kind of relationship between noun and verb. Earlier, we spoke of the separation into two camps, that which is and that which is not, how they're sort of unsustainable by themselves. And as a matter of a mixture, we can have more of that which is and less differentiation, so it's more of a unified object. Or we could have being rest more on the side of difference, so have a lot of multiplicity, a lot of identities, and perhaps not very firm and secure identities in that situation. But when we speak of noun and verb split into two kinds by their relations, as one in which agrees that the participation in being shares the mixture or the blending of that which is and that which is not. There's a match. There's a true relationship. In the case of falsity, there is an improper relationship. So I wish to define this a little bit farther. So again, we have our object, we have Theaetetus, and we have our verb, we have flying. But we also imagine another figure, perhaps symbolized as Theaetetus, and around him are all of the things that are what we might say is true, but this isn't sufficient for where we are at the current moment. For if we say something that is true, we say that there is a match between something. There is a good relationship between something. But when we think about the goodness of a relation, it's easy to fall back into saying the relationship that is. So I think this is the point that we have to think about a little bit farther. This involves a matter of perspective, but I want to rewind. So we are given a statement that is false, a statement that we would say is not true, a statement that does not agree with a particular blending, but it's a blending that transcends a scale, and the scale that emerges in mind is much like the scale that we observed when we saw at the outset of the basic principles of that which is and that which is not, embodied by the king and embodied by the queen. Our second level, our second layer that we stepped up upon, was the bishop and the rook. The bishop being the symbol of the object and the rook being the symbol of the verb. And of course, in that context, we were speaking about speech. So we layered speech upon the reality of the blending that occurs between that which is and that which is not. And by this blending, the two identities have shared in that experience. But we've added a third layer, and I'm trying to see exactly what that third layer is. Now, the third layer can be perspective, it can be perception. In the case, for example, that we have a character that is overseeing speech, he is in charge of speech. He himself, of course, is a blended identity between that which is and that which is not. Using our second layer, which has certain requirements, in order for something to participate in being, it participates by its relationship. So we give it a relationship so it doesn't fall into uselessness, so that it can be interacted with. But effectively what we have is almost another separation that would be akin to moving the object away from the verb. It reduces the speech to a similar state. But the interesting thing is that the speech continues to go through this filter, through which I thought up until this point we can't really have an antagonism that destroys the principle that we established, the fundamentality of object and verb. But if we go up another layer and add perspective, we can see that in the mind of the one that is downstream, or maybe upstream, I should say, he's able to put two things together conceptually and say two things. These two things participate in our definition of speech, in the sense that there is a relationship of participation in being. But the speech does not reflect something. It does not reflect true participation. Now this is an issue, because we're trying to make it through this without saying true. So it does not reflect the participation such that the blended form is actually able to participate with a particular action. And since it is not able to bind itself to that action, it's not able to do it, it's not able to participate in it, it's not able to be related to it. So Theaetetus, he can't bind himself or participate in flying. So by this male union, there is nothing that occurs. I'm interested to see where we go from here, because it would seem that it's not necessary to call this speech, because it is not fulfilling of the relationship that we sort of said at the outset is the whole point of having the object and the verb together, so that they can fill that participation in being. If a statement is false, it doesn't fulfill its participation in being. And so by a certain standard, we could say that it doesn't participate in speech either. But of course, we don't say that naturally. We admit of this falsity of speech. Now we are thrown a bit of a curveball, because we're not really sure if at this point we're going to continue with this line of thinking or move somewhere else. It would seem that we have to converge back onto this, because it's incomplete. The visitor says, well then, isn't it clear by now that both true and false thought and belief and appearance can occur in our souls? Theaetetus doesn't immediately admit that this, yes, he's curious about it. So he says, how? The best way for you to know is for you to first grasp what they are and how they are different from each other. Okay, so let's think about this for a moment. I agree that we must understand what they are, what true and false is. Just as we have established, I think we've established what is true a little bit more firmly than what we have, that which is false, by our speech example, at least in the dialogical sense. But without understanding the true and falsehood at its core, we are stuck with a rather confusing asymmetry or confusing potential contradiction in our fundamental assertions. The visitor says, aren't thought and speech the same, except that what we call thought is speech that occurs without the voice, inside the soul, in conversation with itself. Another side comment here that I think is interesting is the use of the word soul. And I think just by the way that he uses the word soul, we can examine what he thinks about it by its meaning. The soul seems to be this place of inner mind through which that productive capacity of generating meaning occurs. That the soul is the structure that is possible of attributing to reality false relation, but also of true relation. Again, false meaning not agreeing, and true meaning agreeing. Manifesting in the true sense that if one agrees, then one is able to participate. If one disagrees, then they are not able to participate. So, this is the end of the 2 pages. So I'm going to turn the page, we're going to read the next 2 pages, and resume our reflection. Now Theaetetus responds, of course. The visitor, and the stream of sound from the soul that goes through the mouth is called speech? Right. And then again, we know that speech contains what? Affirmation and denial. Yes. So when affirmation or denial occurs as silent thought inside the soul, wouldn't you call that belief? Of course. And what if that doesn't happen on its own, but arises for someone through perception? When that happens, what else could one call it correctly besides appearance? Yes. So since there is true and false speech, and of the processes just mentioned, thinking appeared to be the soul's conversation with itself, belief and conclusion of thinking. And what we call appearing the blending of perception and belief. It follows that since these are all the same kind of thing as speech, some of them must sometimes be false. Of course. So you realize we found false belief in speech sooner than we expected just now. Then we were afraid that to look for it would be to attack a completely hopeless project. Yes. So let's not be discouraged about what's still left, since these other things have come to light. Let's remember the divisions by types that we made earlier. Which ones? We divided copy making into 2 types, likeness making and appearance making. Yes. And we said that we were confused about which one to put the sophist in. Yes. and in our confusion about that we plunged into even greater bewilderment, when an account emerged that disagreed with everyone, by denying that there are likenesses or copies or appearances at all, on the ground that there isn't any falsity in any way anywhere. That's right. But now, since false speech and false belief both appear to be, it's possible for imitations of those that are to be, and for expertise in deception to arise from that state of affairs. Theaetetus says yes. The visitor continues, and we agreed before that the sophist does fall under one of the two types we just mentioned. Yes. Then let's try again to take the kind we've posited and cut it in two. Let's go ahead and always follow the right-hand part of what we've cut, and hold on to things that the sophist is associated with until we strip away everything that he has in common with other things. Then when we've left his own particular nature, let's display it, especially to ourselves, but also to people to whom this sort of procedure is naturally congenial. All right? Didn't we begin by dividing expertise into productive and acquisitive? Yes. And under the acquisitive part, the sophist appeared in hunting, combat, wholesaling, and types of that sort? Of course. But now, since he's included among experts in imitation, first we obviously have to divide productive expertise in two. We say imitation is a sort of production, but of copies and not of the things themselves. Is that right? Absolutely. First of all, production has two parts. What are they? Divine and human. Theaetetus says, I don't understand yet. If you remember how we started, we said that production was any capacity that causes things to come to be that previously were not. I remember. Take animals and everything mortal, including plants and everything on the earth that grows from seeds and roots, and also all lifeless bodies made up inside the earth, whether fusible or not. Are we going to say that anything besides the craftsmanship of a god makes them come to be after previously not being? Or shall we rely on the saying and the widespread belief that what? Are we going to say that the nature produces them by some spontaneous cause that generates them without any thought, or by a cause that works by reason and divine knowledge derived from a god? Theaetetus says, I often shift back and forth on that from one view to the other, maybe because of my age. When I'm focusing on you now, and supposing that you think they come to be by the agency of a god, that's what I think too. So that concludes our 2 pages. Now, one thing that has immediately appeared to me is that we need closure on some prior issue. The prior issue is getting at the nature of this true and falsehood as it relates to that which is not, and speech. And we sort of quickly went through the other types, the belief, appearance. And I realize that I may be putting forth something that I've already stated, but in my mind, going over something a couple times is going to be the thing that really solidifies it. So the thing that I wanted to go over again, and to make sure that it was squared away so we don't miss something important, was the nature of this falsehood. And I think it can be boiled down quite simply, in the sense that falsehood is the misrelation of difference. That is, if the observer is to see some connection between two things. In this case, we're talking about speech, but it could be anything. They will not be able to participate with it. If I cannot see that there is a connection between the object that I hold in my hand, which is a flashlight, and its function or its purpose, or its action, I will not be able to participate in its purpose. I will not be able to see the light or use the light for my purposes. Truth is the proper relation of difference. Again, difference being the thing that outlines identity, and the various interactions among difference causes being to grow, to flourish, to continue, to be, in a sense. That's not fully, because we don't want to get caught in the that which is trap. Again, I know I've said this before. So I think I'm satisfied for the most part as far as that's concerned. So let's continue with our interpretation. So the visitor says that we know that speech contains affirmation and denial. Two interesting words that we have not used yet. When affirmation or denial occurs as silent thought inside the soul, wouldn't you call that belief? Now, to affirm something is to declare it, to state it as a fact, to assert it strongly, to uphold it, to support it, to maintain it. And to deny something is to reject it. To put it down, to put it away. To stop it. And so in this way we see something similar to the subjective point of view of truth and falsehood, that we affirm that which we think is true, and we deny that which we think is false. Now, of course, in the case of speech, we may affirm something that we think is false, that we should be denying in our minds if we wish to be truthful. And we may deny something that we think or know to be true, but we deny it because we wish to manipulate or to deceive someone. But assuming that we are honest within ourselves, this processing of the information that we will get into in a moment that involves perception, but it also involves the interrelationship of as much perception or relevant perception that we have gained from the environment, that has been committed to memory, that has been analyzed, it is put through the network of interrelated things as best as we can understand it. Of course, there might be some falsehood in there somewhere where we misrepresented difference. But this is the internal structure that we use to make sense of our world, our reality. Now the visitor says, and what if it doesn't happen on its own? An interesting way to put that. What if it doesn't happen on its own? I mentioned that of coming to an affirmation or a denial, we are coming from somewhere. The information has been brought to us from someplace. Now, I tend to think that the information that we see is mostly perceptual. What we build on top of our perceptual understanding, our experiences, we may build into something that is greater, a pattern that was not immediately seen in the particulars, but is reflected on a larger scale. And I think that this sort of thing is approaching what the visitor is getting at. Now, eventually he's going to get into the gods, which I think is interesting. He says, what if that doesn't happen on its own, but arises for someone through perception? Now, on one hand, as I've mentioned, perception can be immediate. We can witness an event, and by that event, we can come to an affirmation or a denial. We can experience speech, perhaps. Maybe the Sophist is speaking to us. When that happens, says the visitor, what else could one call it correctly besides appearance? So an interesting definition, I suppose. Why is it interesting? Sometimes the way in which things are defined although it may be a common word, the implicit understanding, while it may not be contrary to some explicit definition, may produce a feeling, or at least it produces a feeling in me sometimes, of a bit of a bewilderment or an awe, a wonder, in the sense that a term that seems so simple can now take on a meaning that causes me to pause and to think about it in a way that if I had used that term in conversation, and if I had to pause and think about many terms in the way that I do now, speech would become completely impractical. But by doing it in an environment in which the immediate consequences for pausing and reflecting are not shown, or maybe I should say that there are no consequences for pausing and reflecting, as there might be in a conversation, then I think at the output, at the other side of that, of the experience of reflecting, the better understanding of the word creates a better implicit understanding through conversation. So forgive me, but today is a new day. A new day brings new thoughts. And today's probably going to be a shorter recording than the usual, just because of time constraints. So all that means is I'll probably pick up again, trying to recover my thoughts in a shorter amount of time than I typically do. Now I sort of remember where we left off. I sort of want to think more about affirmation and denial before we move forward. I can't quite remember if we've gone through the etymology or if I just read it. But in any case, I think that there's additional information that needs to be explained there. So, starting with affirmation, the definition is a declaration that something is true, a positive assertion, or a statement that confirms or supports a proposition. It is from a Latin term, affirmatio, derived from the verb of the Latin, meaning to make steady, strengthen, assert. The prefix ad is to or towards. The suffix firmare, to make firm, to strengthen. So the root meaning is to make firm or to cause to be steady towards something. Denial, on the other hand, is a rejection or negation of a statement, a refusal to accept or to admit something is true. Now, the prefix from the Latin word denegare, to deny or to refuse. De is away, off, or not. Negare is to say no, to refuse, to say something is not. So the root meaning, to say no to something or to speak against. So when we put these two terms in the context that we were speaking about truth and falsehood, I think it becomes less opaque how these terms fall into a degree of relevance here. Regardless, or putting aside whether or not a particular statement is actually true for the moment, just thinking about our own experience, we make affirmations and denials all day long. Some of them are true and some of them are false. But the point being is that this is something quite intimate to us. We know this well. There's something quite useful about the Latin that we can build on, or we use that original meaning that somehow really hasn't gone anywhere. And by this I mean in the context of thinking about the noun and the verb, and that harmony of speech, such that we can recognize proper relation, proper being. If I reach inside of my mind and I take this root meaning for the moment of affirmation, to make firm or to cause to be steady towards something, I think about all of those experiences where I calm myself down, I calm the mind down from all of the noise and the haze that comes about in everyday life. And there is this desire, perhaps it is the will, it is the relationship to the divine logos, that causes this experience of subsiding chaos and the focusing of attention. And when this happens, I think of something that is steady, and I think of something that is progressive. And I say this because in order to accomplish anything, we have to have solid attention on some task or idea. And while our attention may fail us at times, or even if we pay attention to a particular task, the fruits of our labor don't immediately become apparent until sometimes much after we have committed ourselves to something. discipline, and again that focused attention, are the bread and butter of all solutions to problems. And when I go back and I look at the contemporary definition of affirmation, a declaration that something is true, we get to that point because of the faith that we have, the belief that we have, that steady ground, that place of attention is worthwhile, and the information that we receive is supporting our standing. So when we think about affirmation and denial in terms of speech or in terms of thought, staying with affirmation for a moment, we have to consider what it necessarily does to the relationship between the predicate or the verb and the subject. An affirmation seems to indicate that there is an agreement, there is a positive relationship between the two. Positive in the sense that it actually participates in being, that it's something that we can participate in, that we can recognize. On the other hand, a denial is a rejection. A rejection of the relationship between the subject and the predicate, such that we can say that speech is unable to be, in that sense, because it doesn't participate in being. But it's more than just that. It is saying that the way in which the predicate is related to the subject, specifically the predicate itself, that the way it wishes to prompt the subject to be is something that participates actually in non-being, forgetting deception, because that can confuse us a little bit. But a predicate that is unable to participate or draw the subject into being is a denial. When we see it, we deny it. Maybe I should say. So when affirmation or denial occurs as silent thought inside the soul, we call it belief. And what if that doesn't happen on its own, but arises for someone through perception? Now, I know earlier I said that I wanted to think about happening on its own. I sort of went into this conversation about intrinsic understanding versus perceptual information, and much like being and non-being, I think there are two more concepts there that are inseparable. That of information that we take in, and of the seeing eye of mind, of the soul, perhaps as Plato might say, into the patterns of the past and into patterns of the present, and generating predictive patterns for the future. It's not a perfect machine, of course, but it does this in an interesting way. And all of it means that certainly when we get it correct, these patterns they appropriately participate in being. And the important part, at least in my mind, at the moment is that this network, this interconnected web of relations, is something that man participates in. He is not just sort of manufacturing it in his mind, he is seeing it in his mind. Of course, he can see falsely, but not all of the things that he sees or believes is false. So it would seem that this domain, this space of mind that sees the relation of that which is to that which is not, of the verb and the predicate, or the noun and the predicate, there is necessarily an image that takes place. Much of this is not explicitly known, I think, until we become more intentional about it, I suppose, but for the most part it's second nature. I just think about my experience today at work, and I communicate with a lot of different people, and there was no way that I was thinking about this the entire time. Every once in a while I'd have these moments of self-reflection to keep me on track, of course, like many of us do, but I wasn't thinking that every single bit of information that I received, how it adds to my map or my image of reality, the appearance of reality in my mind, given all of the potential for falsehood and for and truth, but also the extended, the meta architecture that the mind develops. Again, because it's not just the experience of now, it is experience of many different times. Much of the information is sacrificed, of course, at different times, but much of the information, important information, is stored and received. Now, the thing I want to focus on a little bit here is the word appearance and the implication. Since we've gone through this thought process of establishing perceived information and how this perceived information influences our beliefs, our thoughts, inner speech, so there's a hint that appearance is similar to what we would call objective. Now, I could say that there is false appearance, right? So we could still see something in the environment, take in information, sensory information, and still be misled by what that information is pointing to. Somebody could dress up in a particular way, and it could deceive us in terms of their purpose, their occupation, their role, whatever that happens to be. The visitor says, "So since there is true and false speech, and of the process just mentioned, thinking appeared to be the soul's conversation with itself, belief, the conclusion of thinking, and what we call appearing, the blending of perception and belief." Okay, so this is an important point to add. So appearing is not just the perceptive information, but it is the combined perceived information and the inner creative process, the production of thought. Now, I would like a farther conversation about belief. I think that's an interesting one, because I find it nearly impossible to separate it from that perceptual information, for the reasons that I've already mentioned. But nonetheless, we'll move forward. And what we call appearing, the blending of perception and belief. It follows that since these are all the same kind of thing as speech, some of them must sometimes be false. We found false belief in speech sooner than we expected just now. Then we were afraid that to look for it would be to attack a completely hopeless project. So let's not be discouraged about that, what's still left. Since these other things have come to light, let's remember the divisions by types that we made earlier. So now the visitor prompts us to think about where we were between the divided copy making and likeness making and appearance making. Now we lost the Sophist for a little while. Couldn't remember where we put him. And this led us to this conversation about what falsehood is. And so we've established an important progression, I would say. In some sense, it's a metaphysical progression. In some sense, it's a strong philosophical progression. Of course, these two are quite related, but the concept of that which is and that which is not is going to stay with us as we move forward, as we move into our biblical ramblings and further Platonic dialogues. This is a very fundamental relationship between the two, having it being established that one doesn't have supremacy over the other, that both are required in order for independent identity to exist. The unfortunate side for the agent that is in the midst of this unfolding creative experience is the potential for incorrect viewing, incorrect seeing, knowing, whatever. And so falsehood and deception are parts also of that experience, intended or not. The visitor says, but now, since false speech and false belief both appear to be, it's possible for imitations of those that are to be, and for expertise in deception to arise from that state of affairs. And we agreed before that the Sophist does fall under one of the two types we just mentioned. So I want to run through a brief exercise regarding what this visitor has to say in the following paragraph. He says, then let's try again to take the kind we've posited and cut it in two. Let's go ahead and always follow the right-hand part of what we've cut, and hold on to things that the Sophist is associated with, until we strip away everything that he has in common with other things. Then when we've left his own peculiar nature, let's display it, especially to ourselves, but also to people to whom this sort of procedure is naturally congenial. So I think that this is essentially a first principles, or a call to first principles thinking, or an approach to solve a problem. But what I want to try and narrow down is some of the language that is used here. So take the kind that we posited. Now, I'm assuming that he's referring to what he said about the imitations of those that are. Now, of course, he could also be talking about copy making, Copy making can be one of those things that is equivalent to those that are. Our division into likeness making and appearance making would be part of that experience, but let's just take for a moment imitations of those that are. And so if we cut it down, we have two parts. It's not necessary at this point to establish what those parts are, but they ought to be fundamental if we are going to explore it much farther. What I find interesting is the sentence when he says, let's go ahead and always follow the right-hand part of what we've cut and hold on to things that the sophist is associated with. Now the right-hand part, I wonder if this means something in particular or if this is just a common expression. When I think about this, I think about when my friend and I have gone hiking. It has been our practice to always turn right, so we sort of know where we're at. We can make our way back to the campsite. And in this way, I sort of think about what the visitor is saying, though it's not as clear-cut in case of the mind when we divide things. I mean, what is right and what is left in that situation. But at the very least, I can appreciate splitting things into two principles, regardless of where they are in terms of their depth or their shallowness. If we start somewhere, we can work our way down or work our way up, whatever the case might be. What I can appreciate, especially in light of everything that we've discussed so far, that things by their association are necessary for them to participate in being, for them themselves to be. And although everything shares in this experience of that which is not, it is a necessary condition for their being to experience it as they participate also in that which is. And by this, these series of relationships, although what we may come to is, in certain cases, less of a concentration of that sophist behavior or sophist identity. In some areas we might find more. It's important that we see these relations. Now let's think about a little bit more about why this is the case. If we take one of our chess pieces, it doesn't matter which one, and we label him the sophist, we are tempted by difference, maybe tempted is the wrong word, but prompted by difference to consider the sophist's independent identity. But much like that which is, it's not really a practical matter to think about the sophist as a symbolic representation of all sophistry. It's important perhaps for a definition to define him, but his participation really is the thing that helps us understand who he is, what his effects are on the minds of others, and so forth. And so if there is this matter between deceiving the mind of that which is and that which is not, it would seem that the sophist uses in an unwillful manner the participation of the queen, who is this sort of that which is not character, the no-thingness, non-being. And by this interaction, by their misrepresentation of her spirit, let's say, what we find is not truth, but a bastardization of her productive energies. And instead of goodness, we find wickedness. We find, in this way, absence. And in the more common tongue, that sort of darkness that's associated with deception, not knowing. Hell perhaps comes into play here. He says, until we strip away everything that he has in common with other things. So, although I mentioned that it's important to understand the visitor's relations, and that understanding the symbolic representation as one of these chess pieces, or whoever the sophist might be, there are limitations, just as we mentioned with that which is not. But all the same, boiling down his identity, in the case of one who deceives, is a little bit different than boiling down an identity of a principle that is not necessarily an agent like man is an agent. And so there may be some productive importance or utility in going through that exercise. He continues, then when we left his own particular nature, let's display it, especially to ourselves, but also to people to whom this sort of procedure is naturally congenial. So perhaps to prevent these people from falling into that trap. And so there's this sort of moral argument that seems to be made here as well. The implication being that the sophist's behavior is amoral. It is a bad thing. So the visitor retraces our steps. He says we've began by dividing expertise into productive and acquisitive. Under the acquisitive part, the sophist appeared in hunting, combat, wholesaling, and types of that sort. But now, since he's included among experts in imitation, first we obviously have to divide productive expertise in two. We say imitation is a sort of production, but of copies and not of things themselves. Production has two parts, divine and human. When we started, we said production was any capacity that causes things to come to be that previously were not. So I want to pause here and think a little bit, because I think this is exactly where I wanted to go, especially in light of the combination of where we have been recently in the Proverbs in the Old Testament, and of the monotheistic religion of God himself. This process ought to be a conception by which we come to some farther or better understanding of God. It should relate us in a better way to God. And I see the hints of where we are going. I had a conversation about a week ago now, last weekend I think it was, with a friend of mine. And it's such a troubled relationship, I think, of late. Most of it's my fault. It must be. For if I wanted it to change, I would take the steps to change it. But I haven't. But the thing that I observed was I was trying to explain what I was doing, with reading Plato and in the way that I do it, with this podcast and everything. And for whatever reason, this person has an aversion, I think largely to the Western experience, partly because of her history, upbringing, this sort of thing. But what I wish so deeply is that we can participate in such a conversation like the one that is being had. And from here, there are many things that could be said, but of my failures, I sort of wonder if when I start here, that I'm trying to, maybe that I come off in this sort of sophist way, in the sense that I'm trying to imitate Plato, whereas I should just take what I have learned and run with it. Start a conversation. Start my own dialogue. Instead of saying that there are things in there that I think you would enjoy, yada yada yada. Sometimes that open-handed superficial approach is not congenial to somebody who has an aversion to something, but rather to show them that they enjoy the sweetness or the fruits of a certain type of experience, and then describe where that experience came from. But I believe that this is important. It is one of these relationships, after all, an important relationship. We can examine the aspects of that which is and that which is not in a quite detailed manner when we think about my friend and I's relationship. But when the matter of production comes to mind, I find myself thinking that this is another step in where we have to go. Because we can think of that which is and that which is not, and we can expand this out into thinking about all sorts of interesting relationships among things. It's easier, I think, in this way to get at the heart of something by understanding their relations, understanding difference. But the productive element is not really something that we've talked about. We've just sort of been taking that which is and that which is not as their own flavors, their own identities. And so now when we are asked to think about production, in the context of expertise, and we are dividing now this production into human and divine, there is a certain capacity that is similar among them. Although they're separated into two categories, they still participate in that broader production. And by our Old Testament reading, we understand that human beings, in the same way that God does, participates in creation, which I suppose is another way to say production. But it is bringing those things into being that were not before, as the visitor says. And so one has to wonder, what is this process? For we're not necessarily considering something from nothing, or nothing from something. There's an element in which we are thinking about nothing coming into being, but in a broader sense, it's a part of that relational structure that already exists. In that way, I find myself going down this sort of rabbit hole of this infinite rabbit hole, for which I might say that, well, the thing that we are identifying is something that is, but this thing that is something that participates in being and non-being, that which is not. But we've also established that that which is not is, because it participates in being. And so this superstructure begins to emerge, although it's a bit opaque to me at this moment. I think within it lies a better and stronger relationship to God, surely. The visitor says, take animals and everything mortal, including plants and everything on the earth that grows from seeds and roots, and also all lifeless bodies made up inside the earth, whether fusible or not. Are we going to say that anything besides the craftsmanship of a god makes them come to be after previously not being? Or shall we rely on saying that the widespread belief that what? Says Theaetetus. Are we going to say that nature produces them by some spontaneous cause that generates them without any thought, or by any cause that works by reason and divine knowledge derived from a god? So this is the central question. It's the central question that we are still battling over today. We've had a massive shift in our culture between one that is a believing spiritual culture to one that is a non-believing, rational, and increasingly meaningless society, existence, culture, whatever. Now, I think the proper treatment of this is better fit for a new episode, since we are at the end of our 2 hours here. So I'll end this episode next time to continue with part 11, likely to be our last part in this series. Until next time.